It was a quiet night, the kind where the distant hum of streetlights and the occasional car passing by were the only sounds breaking the stillness. Isaiah Carter, a successful entrepreneur in his late 30s, was driving home with his close friend Malcolm Evans, a well-known community leader. The two had just left a networking event and were enjoying the peaceful drive, reflecting on the night's conversations. As Isaiah navigated the nearly empty streets, he noticed the unmistakable glow of flashing blue and red lights in his rearview mirror. A police car was tailing them, its lights spinning in the darkness. He sighed and slowed the car. "Why are they pulling us over?" Malcolm asked, glancing at Isaiah with a puzzled expression. "I have no idea," Isaiah replied, his voice calm but wary. They hadn't been speeding, hadn't broken any laws. He guided the car to the curb and exhaled, already bracing himself for what could come next. Despite his success, Isaiah knew that being a black man in America often meant carrying the burden of suspicion. No matter how well-dressed, well-spoken, or well-accomplished he was, he had seen this scenario play out too many times. One wrong move, one misplaced word, and the situation could spiral out of control. Two officers approached the vehicle. The younger of the two, Officer Reed, reached the driver's side first. His stance was stiff, his expression unreadable. He didn't greet them, didn't explain the reason for the stop. Instead, his voice came sharp and demanding. "License and registration." Isaiah, composed as always, reached for his wallet and handed over his documents. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, keeping his tone measured. Reed barely glanced at the license before turning to Malcolm. "You too," he snapped, signaling for his ID. Malcolm hesitated for a second, his jaw tightening. There was no reason for them to ask for his identification. He wasn't driving, but he knew better than to argue. With a slow nod, he pulled out his ID and handed it over, his expression dark with quiet frustration. Isaiah watched Reed carefully, noticing the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers hovered near his belt. This wasn't routine. This was something else. Reed exchanged a glance with his partner, Officer Daniels, before muttering something under his breath. Whatever was said, it was enough to make Daniels nod. The shift was subtle, but Isaiah felt it. The silent decision had been made. "Step out of the vehicle," Reed ordered, his voice edged with authority. Isaiah's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "Officer, can you tell me why we're being stopped?" "You're acting suspiciously," Reed shot back, his hand drifting closer to his holster. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." Isaiah glanced at Malcolm, whose jaw clenched. "This is wrong," Malcolm muttered under his breath. Isaiah inhaled deeply, pushing back the frustration rising in his chest. He knew arguing would only escalate the situation. Without another word, he unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped out, moving slowly and deliberately. Malcolm followed, his movements just as careful. The night, once peaceful, had shifted. The flashing police lights painted their faces in shades of red and blue, casting long shadows against the pavement. In that moment, they weren't respected men. They weren't community leaders. They were just two black men standing under the weight of suspicion, and they both knew exactly how dangerous that could be. Isaiah and Malcolm stood beside the car, their hands at their sides, careful not to make any sudden movements. The night air was cool, but tension made it feel stifling. Officer Reed took a step closer, his hand resting on his holster, eyes scanning their faces like he was waiting for an excuse. "Turn around," he ordered. "Hands behind your backs." Isaiah's heartbeat pounded in his ears. "Officer, we haven't done anything wrong," he said, keeping his voice even. "You're acting suspiciously," Reed repeated, his tone flat and unyielding. "Turn around." Malcolm exhaled sharply. "Suspicious how?" he asked, frustration seeping through his words. "We were driving home. That's it." "Are you resisting?" Reed snapped. Isaiah shot Malcolm a warning look, one that said, "Not here, not now." He turned around first, slowly placing his hands behind his back. Malcolm hesitated for a brief second before doing the same. The sharp bite of cold steel wrapped around Isaiah's wrists as Reed fastened the handcuffs too tightly. Malcolm's face hardened as Officer Daniels did the same to him. Isaiah clenched his jaw as he heard the metallic click. The humiliation settled in, heavy and suffocating. Two grown men, successful in their own right, now reduced to suspects on the side of the road. A car passed by, slowing just enough for the driver to get a better look. Another followed. Isaiah knew what they saw. Two black men in cuffs, bathed in flashing police lights, standing beside their luxury car. They weren't seeing Isaiah Carter, CEO, or Malcolm Evans, activist. They were seeing what they had been conditioned to see. Daniels led Malcolm toward the squad car while Reed kept a firm grip on Isaiah's arm. "We're running your IDs," Reed said, almost as if he was waiting for something to pop up. A warrant, a previous arrest, anything to justify what they had already decided about them. Minutes passed. They felt like hours. Isaiah flexed his fingers, feeling the metal dig into his skin. "What do you think they're looking for?" he murmured to Malcolm. Malcolm scoffed under his breath. "A reason." They both knew how this worked. If they waited long enough, maybe the officers would find some excuse to make this stop seem legitimate. If not, well, some officers didn't need excuses. More cars drove by. Some drivers averted their eyes, unwilling to acknowledge what was happening. Others watched with mild curiosity, their faces unreadable. The street, once quiet and familiar, now felt foreign, like a battlefield they hadn't chosen. Reed and Daniels stood by their patrol car, staring at the laptop screen. Their faces were unreadable at first, but then something shifted. Daniels straightened up. Reed's jaw tensed. He looked back at Isaiah and Malcolm, then quickly leaned toward his partner, whispering something urgent. Isaiah could see it in their faces before they even moved. Something was wrong, or rather, something was very wrong for them. Reed's eyes darted between the glowing laptop screen and Isaiah, his face shifting from rigid authority to something dangerously close to panic. He leaned toward Daniels, whispering harshly under his breath. Daniels' brows furrowed. His gaze flickered to Isaiah and Malcolm, then back to the screen. "Are you sure?" Daniels asked, his voice low but urgent. Reed swallowed hard. "It's him! Look at the damn screen!" Daniels hesitated for only a second before his face paled. "Jesus!" Without another word, he turned and rushed back toward Isaiah, fumbling with his keyring. The urgency in his movements was unmistakable. Reed followed, his usual confidence now tainted with unease. Isaiah remained still, watching them approach, his face unreadable. Daniels reached him first, struggling with the cuffs in his haste. "Mr. Carter, sir, there's been—" He cleared his throat. "There's been a misunderstanding." Malcolm let out a humorless chuckle. "You don't say." Reed moved to unlock Malcolm's cuffs, his fingers clumsy and uncertain. We didn't realize." Isaiah rolled his wrists, feeling the sting of raw skin where the metal had dug in. "Didn't realize what?" he asked, his tone eerily calm. Reed swallowed again, his Adam's apple bobbing. We weren't aware of who you were." Isaiah nodded slowly. "And who am I?" Neither officer answered. Isaiah took a step closer, holding their gaze. "You ran my ID. You know exactly who I am." Daniels opened his mouth, then shut it again. Malcolm crossed his arms. "Go ahead, say it." The silence stretched between them. The only sounds were the distant hum of traffic and the still flashing police lights casting eerie shadows across the pavement. Finally, Daniels exhaled, barely above a whisper. "You're Isaiah Carter, founder of the Carter Initiative, advisor to the mayor." Isaiah gave a slow nod. "And yet, 5 minutes ago, I was just another suspicious black man on the side of the road." Reed's lips pressed into a thin line, his face taut with discomfort. Malcolm tilted his head. "If this is how you treat him, what happens to the ones you don't recognize?" Reed flinched slightly at the words, as if they had physically struck him. Daniels looked away. The weight of it all hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Isaiah studied them both for a long moment before speaking again, his voice quiet but sharp enough to cut through the night. "You need to think long and hard about why this happened. Not because of who I am, but because of what you assumed before you even knew." Neither officer had a response. Isaiah turned, walking toward his car. Malcolm followed. They didn't rush. They didn't run. They didn't need to. The officers remained standing, frozen in place, the realization settling into their bones. The flashing lights continued to spin, bathing the empty street in red and blue. For the first time that night, neither Isaiah nor Malcolm were the ones being judged. By morning, word of what had happened spread through the department like wildfire. Whispers filled the hallways, bouncing from desk to desk, growing louder with each retelling. The officers who had been on duty the night before exchanged uneasy glances, some shaking their heads, others too stunned to speak. Everyone knew what could have happened if things had escalated just a little further. Reed and Daniels were called into a private meeting before their shifts even started. Inside, a panel of senior officers and internal affairs representatives sat in silence, watching as the two men shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The weight of their mistake hung over them like a storm cloud. Disciplinary action was swift. Reed, the more aggressive of the two, was suspended pending an internal review. Daniels received a formal reprimand, but it wasn't just about them anymore. Later that afternoon, Isaiah Carter walked through the doors of the precinct, not as a suspect, but as a man demanding change. In a closed-door session, he led a meeting on racial profiling, standing in front of a room full of officers, many of whom refused to meet his gaze. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He spoke with the quiet authority of a man who had lived this reality long before last night. "This isn't just about me," Isaiah said, his voice even, measured. "It's about every person who gets judged before they even have a chance to be heard. If I hadn't been someone you recognized, if my name hadn't meant something to the right people, how would that night have ended?" Silence. No one had an answer. Some of the officers in the room shifted uncomfortably. Others looked down, avoiding his stare. But Isaiah wasn't interested in apologies. He wanted accountability. He wanted action. Later that evening, he and Malcolm sat on the balcony of Isaiah's apartment, watching the city lights flicker against the dark sky. The night air was cooler now, less suffocating than before. Malcolm exhaled, shaking his head. "Even with all you've done, all you've built, none of it mattered in that moment." Isaiah nodded. "I know." A beat of silence passed between them. "This isn't over," Isaiah said, his voice steady. Malcolm leaned back, eyes fixed on the horizon. It's not. They had more work to do, and they weren't stopping anytime soon. The next day, the story spread beyond the precinct. It was no longer just an internal embarrassment. It became a conversation. Local news outlets picked up the story, framing it as another case of racial profiling gone wrong. Social media exploded with opinions, debates, and questions. Some people were outraged, demanding justice. Others dismissed it, saying, "At least nothing bad happened." Isaiah knew better. The problem wasn't just what had happened to him. The problem was that it could have been anyone, and too often it ended much worse. That night, as he scrolled through the flood of comments and reactions, he saw people sharing their own stories. Stories of being stopped for no reason. Stories of being searched, questioned, humiliated, just for existing in the wrong place, at the wrong time, in the wrong skin. Malcolm sent him a message. "We have to keep this going." Isaiah didn't need convincing. He had already decided. He picked up his phone, opened his social media, and typed, "This isn't just my story, it's ours. If you've been through this, if you've felt this, if you've watched this happen and stayed silent, now's the time to speak. Drop your location in the comments. Tell your story. Share this. Let them know we're not invisible." He hit post. Within minutes, the notifications started rolling in. Comments poured from every state, every city, every corner of the world. Some with anger, some with sorrow, some just saying, "I see you." And just like that, the conversation grew louder, because silence had never changed anything, and it never would. This isn't just a story, it's reality. It's happening every day, in cities and neighborhoods across the country. And until we face it, speak up, and demand change, it won't stop. If this story resonated with you, don't stay silent. Like, share, and drop your location in the comments. Let the world see that this isn't just one person's experience. It's a fight we all have a stake in. And if you believe in telling stories that matter, stories that challenge, expose, and inspire, subscribe to the channel. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a video and be part of a movement that refuses to look away. Because awareness is the first step toward justice, and justice starts with all of us.